Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most devastating trade wars, where Britain essentially became the world's most successful drug cartel, and China paid the price with an empire. This is the story of how a single flower brought down the Middle Kingdom, turning tea, sipping British merchants into opium kingpins, and transforming the world's greatest civilization into history's largest rehab center. So, before we watch an empire crumble in real time, go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready for this wild ride. And subscribe if you want more stories where economics meets absolute chaos. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see our global audience coming together for these deep dives into history's darkest chapters. Now grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, maybe light a candle for that cozy vibe, and let's explore how the innocent looking opium poppy managed to do what no army had ever accomplished. Completely destroy China's greatest empire from the inside out. Picture this: you're living in 1839, and you're the emperor of the most powerful nation on earth. Your empire stretches across vast territories. Your population numbers in the hundreds of millions, and foreign diplomats literally prostrate themselves before your throne. You control the world's most coveted luxury goods: silk, tea, and porcelain, and every European merchant dreams of accessing your markets. You are, without question, sitting pretty at the top of the global food chain. Now imagine that within just a few decades, your mighty empire would be carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. Your people would become the sick man of Asia, and your once proud military would be humiliated by a handful of foreign gunboats. What could possibly bring down such a colossus? The answer, my friend, is a flower. Specifically, the innocent-looking opium poppy, whose milky sap would prove more destructive to Chinese civilization than any army that had ever marched across its borders. This is the story of how a drug turned the Middle Kingdom into the world's largest rehabilitation center, and how Britain essentially became history's most successful drug dealer. It's a tale that makes modern pharmaceutical scandals look like playground disputes, and it all started with tea. Yes, tea. That civilized little beverage that your grandmother insists cures everything from headaches to heartbreak. In the 18th century, tea was cocaine, level addictive to Europeans, except it was socially acceptable and didn't make you want to reorganize your sock drawer at 3 a.m. The British, in particular, couldn't get enough of the stuff. They were consuming it by the shipload, turning afternoon tea into a religious ceremony, and basically making it impossible for any self-respecting Brit to function without their daily cuppa. Here's where things got interesting. The Chinese, who had been perfecting the art of tea cultivation for centuries, had a monopoly on the good stuff. They also had silk that made European fabric look like burlap, and porcelain so fine it made local pottery seem like children's mud pies. Naturally, every European merchant wanted in on this action. But there was a problem. The Chinese weren't particularly interested in European goods. Imagine trying to trade your homemade friendship bracelets for a Rolex, and you'll get the idea. The Chinese looked at European manufactured goods with about as much enthusiasm as you'd show for a gas station sandwich. They had everything they needed, thank you very much, and they certainly didn't need whatever the barbarians from across the seas were peddling. This created what economists politely call a trade imbalance, but what the British called a financial nightmare. Silver was flowing out of European coffers like water from a broken dam, all to pay for Chinese luxuries that Europeans absolutely had to have. The British East India Company, which was essentially a corporation with its own army, imagine Amazon with battleships, was hemorrhaging money trying to satisfy British tea addiction. The Chinese emperor, meanwhile, was quite content with this arrangement. Foreign devils could keep their silver coming, and in return, they'd receive the finest goods in the world. It was like being the only dealer of something everyone desperately wanted. And the Chinese were more than happy to play that role. They controlled the terms of trade, decided when and where foreigners could do business, and generally treated European merchants like particularly persistent door-to-door salesmen. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, was at the height of its power. Emperor Qianlong, who reigned for 60 years in the 18th century, presided over an empire that was arguably the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilization on the planet. The Chinese had invented everything from gunpowder to paper money while Europeans were still figuring out basic hygiene. Their agricultural techniques fed hundreds of millions, their art and literature flourished, and their administrative system was the envy of the world. But success, as any ancient Greek tragedian could tell you, often plants the seeds of destruction. The Qing Empire's very prosperity made it conservative and complacent. Why change a system that was working so well? Why modernize when you were already the most advanced civilization on Earth? Why worry about foreign barbarians when they were clearly inferior in every conceivable way? This attitude was perfectly encapsulated in Emperor Qianlong's famous response to a British diplomatic mission in 1793. Lord Macartney had travelled all the way to Beijing with samples of British-manufactured goods, hoping to establish better trade relations. The Emperor's reply was basically the 18th century equivalent of, "Thanks but no thanks." He wrote to King George Ebbe, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There was therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians." Talk about famous last words. While the Chinese were patting themselves on the back for their self-sufficiency, the British were cooking up a solution to their trade problem that would make Pablo Escobar look like a small-time dealer. They had discovered something the Chinese wanted, even if they didn't know it yet: opium. Opium, for those blissfully unaware, is derived from the opium poppy, a plant that looks about as innocent as a flower can look while harbouring the chemical equivalent of a nuclear weapon. When processed, it produces a dark, sticky substance that, when smoked, creates a euphoric high that makes users forget about little things like food, hygiene, and responsible life choices. It's also viciously addictive, turning productive members of society into hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves. The British had been growing opium poppies in India for decades, initially for medical purposes. Opium was a legitimate medicine in the 18th and early 19th centuries. It was the only effective painkiller available, and doctors prescribed it for everything from headaches to broken hearts. Every pharmacy stocked laudanum, a tincture of opium that was as common as aspirin is today. Even respectable Victorian ladies sipped opium, laced medicines for their nerves. But the British East India Company's brilliant and morally bankrupt realization was that opium could solve their Chinese trade problem. If the Chinese wouldn't buy British-manufactured goods, maybe they'd buy something that would make them not care about anything else. It was like discovering that your stern, disapproving teacher had a weakness for chocolate. Except this chocolate would ruin their life. The scheme was diabolically simple. The East India Company would grow opium in India, sell it to Chinese drug dealers, and use the profits to buy tea, silk, and porcelain. It was the perfect crime. The British government could claim they weren't directly involved in drug trafficking. They were just growing a plant in India, while private merchants did the dirty work of actually smuggling it into China. This wasn't some small-scale operation run by shady characters in dark alleys. This was industrial-scale drug trafficking, complete with corporate planning, supply chain management, and quarterly profit reports. The British turned drug dealing into a science, and the Chinese market was about to become their laboratory. The first British opium shipments to China were modest affairs, but they revealed something alarming: Chinese demand for the drug was potentially limitless. Unlike tea or silk, which satisfied specific needs, opium created its own demand. Users didn't just want it, they needed it, with the desperate compulsion that only addiction can provide. Each customer was essentially a guaranteed repeat buyer for life, however short that life might become. Chinese authorities initially paid little attention to the opium trade. A few foreign ships bringing in some medicine hardly seemed worth imperial concern. The Qing Empire had bigger fish to fry, managing a vast territory, collecting taxes, and maintaining the delicate balance of power that kept hundreds of millions of people in line. Besides, if some foreigners wanted to trade drugs for silver, wasn't that just another source of revenue? This casual attitude would prove to be one of history's most expensive mistakes. By the time Chinese officials realized what was happening, opium had already begun its insidious work. What started as a trickle of users in coastal cities quickly became a flood that would wash across the entire empire. The drug's progression through Chinese society followed a predictable but devastating pattern. It started with the wealthy and educated, people with disposable income and access to foreign goods. Merchants, government officials, and scholars began experimenting with opium as a recreational activity, much like wine tasting or poetry recitation. It was exotic, expensive, and fashionable among the sophisticated elite. But opium didn't stay confined to genteel parlours and scholarly gatherings. As use spread and prices dropped, the drug filtered down through every level of Chinese society. Labourers smoked it to forget their back, breaking work. Farmers used it to escape the drudgery of subsistence living, and soldiers turned to it for courage or comfort. What had started as an upper-class vice became a national epidemic that respected no boundaries of wealth, education, or social standing. The Chinese had encountered nothing like opium addiction in their long history. They had alcohol, of course, but drinking culture in China was generally moderate and ritualized. They had gambling, but even chronic gamblers could occasionally win. Opium was different. It was a one-way ticket to personal destruction that masqueraded as pleasure. Users chased an increasingly elusive high while their health, wealth, and relationships crumbled around them. The physical effects of opium addiction were horrifying to witness. Chronic users developed a characteristic appearance that contemporaries called the opium look. Sunken eyes, yellowed skin, emaciated frame, and a hollow, distant expression that suggested the person inside had already departed. Opium addicts stopped caring about food, hygiene, work, or family. They lived only for their next pipe, and everything else became negotiable. But the individual tragedy of addiction was just the beginning. As opium use spread throughout Chinese society, it began to undermine the very foundations of imperial administration. Government officials who were supposed to collect taxes, maintain infrastructure, and enforce laws were instead spending their time and money in opium dens. Military officers charged with defending the empire were more interested in their next fix than their next battle. Scholars who should have been studying for imperial examinations were lying in stupors, dreaming away their futures in clouds of opium smoke. The economic impact was equally devastating. China had always been a silver importing economy. Foreign merchants brought silver to buy Chinese goods. But now that flow was reversing, as Chinese addicts spent their savings, sold their possessions, and even borrowed money to buy opium. Silver that should have stayed in China to fuel economic growth was instead flowing back out to pay for drugs. The empire's trade surplus, built up over centuries, began evaporating in opium smoke. The British, meanwhile, were delighted with their new business model. Opium sales to China were generating enormous profits, far more than traditional trade goods ever had. The East India Company's opium revenues helped finance Britain's expanding empire, fund its military adventures, and support its growing industrial economy. British merchants in China were getting rich beyond their wildest dreams, and all they had to do was sell a product that sold itself. The irony was delicious, at least from the British perspective. For centuries, the Chinese had treated European traders like unwanted relatives at a wedding, tolerated but not welcomed, controlled but not respected. The Chinese had dictated the terms of trade, limited where foreigners could do business, and generally acted like they were doing Europeans a favor by allowing them to spend their silver on Chinese goods. Now the tables were turning. Chinese customers weren't just buying British goods, they were desperately craving them. Opium addicts would pay any price, travel any distance, and take any risk to get their hands on the drug. For the first time in the history of East-West trade, the Chinese were the dependent party, and British merchants were loving every minute of it. The Chinese government's initial response to the opium crisis was confused and ineffective. The Qing bureaucracy, designed to handle traditional problems like floods, famines, and rebellions, was utterly unprepared for a drug epidemic. How do you write regulations for something that didn't exist in Chinese experience? How do you punish people for a crime that they commit against themselves? Early anti-opium addicts read like the work of officials who didn't quite understand what they were dealing with. They banned the black mud and imposed penalties on users and dealers, but they approached opium like it was just another luxury import that could be regulated through traditional methods. They might as well have tried to stop a hurricane with a strongly worded letter. The problem was compounded by corruption within the Chinese administrative system. Many of the officials responsible for enforcing anti-opium laws were themselves users or were taking bribes from opium dealers. It's hard to wage a war on drugs when your generals are high and your foot soldiers are on the payroll of the enemy. The Chinese discovered what every society that has tried to ban addictive substances eventually learns. Prohibition works only if the people enforcing it actually want it to work. By the 1830s, the opium trade had grown from a minor irritant to an existential threat to the Chinese empire. Conservative estimates suggested that there were over 2 million opium addicts in China, though the real number was probably much higher. In some regions, particularly around coastal trading cities, addiction rates approached epidemic levels. Entire communities were being hollowed out by drug abuse, their social fabric shredded by a substance that turned productive citizens into dependent ghosts. The silver drain had also reached crisis proportions. Chinese merchants were spending an estimated 30 million silver dollars annually on opium. Money that should have been circulating through the domestic economy was instead flowing into British pockets. The empire's monetary system, based on silver currency, was beginning to destabilize. Silver became scarce and expensive, making it harder for ordinary Chinese to conduct business or pay their taxes. Perhaps most alarmingly, the opium epidemic was beginning to affect the military. Chinese soldiers, many of whom had turned to opium to cope with poor conditions and irregular pay, were increasingly unreliable. Officers found themselves commanding armies of addicts, men who might fight bravely one day and disappear into an opium den the next. The military discipline that had allowed the Qing to conquer and control their vast empire was dissolving in opium smoke. It was at this critical moment that Emperor Daoguang decided to take decisive action. He appointed Lin Zexu, an upright and energetic official with a reputation for getting things done, as imperial commissioner with full powers to end the opium trade once and for all. It was like appointing a fire chief to deal with a forest fire that had been burning for decades, but Lin Zexu was determined to succeed where others had failed. Lin Zexu was exactly the kind of official the Chinese bureaucratic system was designed to produce. Intelligent, educated, incorruptible, and utterly convinced of the superiority of Chinese civilization. He had successfully dealt with other crises during his career, and he approached the opium problem with the confidence of a man who believed that right thinking and proper administration could solve any problem. His first step was to study the enemy. Lin Zexu did his homework, learning everything he could about opium, its effects, and the foreign merchants who were importing it. He was particularly interested in understanding Western motivations and methods. Why were the British so determined to poison Chinese society, and how could they be stopped? What Lin Zexu discovered appalled him. The opium trade wasn't some accidental byproduct of legitimate commerce. It was a deliberate and systematic attempt to weaken Chinese society for British advantage. Foreign merchants weren't just making money from Chinese suffering, they were actively promoting addiction to create larger markets for their product. It was economic warfare disguised as free trade, and Lin Zexu was determined to fight back. His strategy was characteristically Chinese in its blend of moral authority and practical action. Lin Zexu began by writing a famous letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her sense of justice and morality. Surely, he reasoned, the Queen of England wouldn't knowingly allow her subjects to poison Chinese children and destroy Chinese families. The letter was a masterpiece of diplomatic courtesy wrapped around a core of moral outrage. Your Majesty has not before been thus officially notified, Lin Zexu wrote, and you may not know how hurtful opium is to mankind. Opium is a poison undermining the framework of a country. He pointed out that Britain itself banned opium use. So how could British merchants justify selling it to Chinese customers? Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly your honourable ruler would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused. The letter was logical, persuasive, and completely ignored by the British government. Queen Victoria probably never even saw it, and if she had, she might have wondered why the Emperor of China was writing to her about what was essentially a private business matter. The British government maintained the fiction that they weren't directly involved in the opium trade. They were just allowing their subjects to engage in lawful commerce. Having failed to appeal to British morality, Lin Zexu decided to take direct action. In March 1839, he arrived in Canton, the centre of China's foreign trade, with orders to end the opium trade immediately and completely. His approach was methodical and implacable. He would confiscate every ounce of opium in the city, arrest every dealer he could find, and make it clear that the party was over. Lin Zexu's arrival in Canton was like a lightning bolt striking a powder magazine. Foreign merchants, who had been making fortunes from opium sales, suddenly found themselves facing a Chinese official who couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or reasoned with. Lin Zexu meant business, and his business was putting them out of business. His first move was to surround the foreign trading factories in Canton and demand that foreign merchants surrender all their opium stocks. Not sell them, not store them somewhere safe, surrender them for destruction. He also demanded that foreign merchants sign pledges, promising never to deal in opium again, with the understanding that violators would face the death penalty. The foreign merchants were caught completely off guard. They had been operating in China for decades under an informal system that allowed them to do pretty much whatever they wanted as long as they paid the right bribes to the right officials. Suddenly they were facing a Chinese official who treated their opium stocks like contraband and their business activities like crimes. The British merchants' response was to play for time while appealing to their government for help. They claimed they couldn't possibly surrender their opium. It belonged to their investors back in Britain, and they had no legal authority to give it away. Besides, they argued, the opium trade was perfectly legal under British law, and Chinese attempts to interfere with it violated principles of free trade. Lin Zexu was unimpressed by these arguments. From his perspective, Foreign merchants were drug dealers who had been poisoning Chinese society for decades, and their legal technicalities were irrelevant. He had been sent to Canton to solve the opium problem, and he intended to solve it by eliminating the opium supply. When diplomatic pressure failed to produce results, Lin Zexu escalated to more direct methods. He cut off food supplies to the foreign trading factories, prevented Chinese servants from working for foreign merchants, and made it clear that no foreign ships would be allowed to leave Canton until the opium was surrendered. It was the 19th century equivalent of a police siege, and Lin Zexu was prepared to wait as long as necessary. The siege worked. Faced with starvation and complete isolation, the foreign merchants finally agreed to surrender their opium stocks. Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade in China, took responsibility for the decision, promising that the British government would compensate merchants for their losses. In total, over 20,000 chests of opium were handed over to Chinese authorities, enough drugs to supply millions of addicts. Lin Zexu's disposal of the confiscated opium was as symbolic as it was practical. Rather than simply burning the drugs, which might have allowed some to be salvaged, he ordered them dissolved in specially constructed pools using salt water and lime. The mixture was then flushed into the Pearl River during a ceremony that included prayers and offerings to the sea god, asking forgiveness for polluting the waters with such a harmful substance. The destruction of the opium took 23 days and became one of the most dramatic anti-drug operations in history. Lin Zexu personally supervised the process, ensuring that every chest was opened and every ounce destroyed. Foreign merchants were required to witness the destruction of their former property, watching their fortunes dissolve literally before their eyes. From Lin Zexu's perspective, the operation was a complete success. He had eliminated the immediate opium supply, demonstrated Chinese resolve, and sent a clear message that the drug trade would no longer be tolerated. He wrote triumphantly to the emperor that the barbarians had been taught a lesson they wouldn't forget, and that the opium crisis was finally over. He couldn't have been more wrong. The destruction of the opium was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of a much larger conflict that would ultimately destroy everything Lin Zexu had tried to protect. The British government, rather than accepting Chinese sovereignty over Chinese markets, decided to treat the opium confiscation as an act of war against British commerce. The British response was swift and devastating. They dispatched a naval task force to China with orders to secure reparations for the destroyed opium and to establish more favourable trading conditions for British merchants. The First Opium War had begun, though the British preferred to call it the First China War. Opium War sounded too much like they were fighting to defend drug dealers. The war was a mismatch of epic proportions. The Chinese military, despite its impressive size and long traditions, was still essentially a medieval force facing an industrial age enemy. Chinese soldiers carried spears, swords, and antiquated firearms, while British forces had modern rifles, artillery, and most importantly, steam-powered warships that could navigate Chinese rivers and attack targets far inland. The British naval strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than attacking heavily fortified coastal positions, they used their superior mobility to strike where Chinese defences were weakest. Steam-powered gunboats could sail up Chinese rivers, appear suddenly at defenceless cities, and demand surrenders before Chinese reinforcements could arrive. It was like using motorcycles to fight cavalry. Speed and technology trumped numbers and courage. Chinese resistance was brave but futile. At the Battle of Canton in 1841, Chinese defenders threw everything they had at the British attackers. Fire ships, cannon, even swimming attacks by individual soldiers. Nothing worked. British firepower was simply too overwhelming, and Chinese weapons too outdated to compete. The city fell after minimal British casualties. and the pattern was repeated throughout the war. Perhaps the most humiliating Chinese defeat came at the Battle of the Bogue, where British forces destroyed an entire Chinese fleet without suffering a single death. Chinese war junks, some of them centuries old, were no match for modern British warships with rifled guns and explosive shells. The Chinese admiral committed suicide rather than report his defeat to the emperor. The war's outcome was never really in doubt, but its speed was shocking even to the British. Within 2 years, British forces had captured key Chinese ports, occupied strategic islands, and demonstrated their ability to strike anywhere along China's vast coastline. The Qing military, which had conquered a continent and ruled hundreds of millions, proved helpless against a few dozen British warships. Lin Zexu, the architect of Chinese resistance, was dismissed in disgrace and exiled to a remote frontier province. The emperor, desperate to end the war, replaced him with officials willing to negotiate with the British. It was a complete reversal of Chinese policy, from confident confrontation to humiliating appeasement. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, was China's first unequal treaty, the first time in centuries that China had been forced to accept terms dictated by a foreign power. The treaty's provisions were designed to prevent any future Chinese interference with British commerce while ensuring that British merchants would never again face the kind of treatment they had received from Lin Zexu. The British demands were comprehensive and humiliating. China was required to pay a massive indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, equivalent to several years of imperial revenue, to compensate Britain for the costs of the war and the destroyed opium. 5 Chinese ports were to be opened to British trade, with British officials allowed to set their own trading rules. The island of Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in perpetuity, giving the British a permanent base for future operations. Most importantly for British merchants, the treaty said nothing about opium. While the Chinese had fought the war to end the drug trade, the peace treaty didn't even mention it. Opium importation resumed immediately after the treaty was signed, and British merchants found themselves in a much stronger position than before the war. They now had legal protections, permanent bases, and the backing of British military power. The Treaty of Nanking opened the floodgates for what the Chinese would later call their century of humiliation. Other Western powers, seeing China's weakness, demanded similar concessions. The United States negotiated trading rights, France secured privileges for Catholic missionaries, and smaller European nations insisted on their share of Chinese concessions. What had started as a British war to protect opium smuggling became a general assault on Chinese sovereignty. The Second Opium War, fought from 1856 to 1860, completed China's humiliation. This conflict was even more devastating than the first, with British and French forces marching all the way to Beijing and forcing the emperor to flee his own capital. The Summer Palace, one of China's greatest architectural treasures, was looted and burned by European soldiers as punishment for Chinese resistance. The war's conclusion. The Convention of Beijing extended foreign privileges even further. More ports were opened to foreign trade. Christian missionaries were given the right to travel throughout China, and foreign diplomats were allowed to establish permanent legations in Beijing. Most devastatingly, opium importation was explicitly legalized, removing even the pretense that foreign powers disapproved of the drug trade. By 1860, the transformation of China was complete. The proud empire that had once treated foreign visitors as barbarians seeking the benefits of Chinese civilization was now a semi-colonial state whose markets were controlled by foreign merchants and whose policies were dictated by foreign gunboats. The Middle Kingdom had become the sick man of Asia, and opium was both the cause and the symbol of its decline. The human cost of this transformation was staggering. Opium addiction continued to spread throughout Chinese society, reaching an estimated 40 million users by the late 19th century. That's roughly 1 in 10 Chinese people, men, women, and children, dependent on a foreign drug that drained their wealth, destroyed their health, and undermined their society's foundations. The economic impact was equally devastating. China's trade surplus, built up over centuries, had become a massive deficit as silver flowed out to pay for opium and other foreign goods. Traditional Chinese industries, unable to compete with manufactured foreign products, collapsed or stagnated. The empire's finances were in perpetual crisis. With tax revenues insufficient to pay for basic government services, let alone the massive indemnities demanded by foreign powers. The social consequences were perhaps the most destructive of all. The Confucian system that had held Chinese society together for over 2 millennia was breaking down under the pressure of foreign influence and domestic chaos. Traditional authority structures, the emperor, the bureaucracy, the family hierarchy, were losing their legitimacy as they proved unable to protect Chinese society from foreign exploitation. Rebellions and uprisings became endemic as desperate Chinese turned to violence to express their frustration with a system that no longer served their needs. The Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864, was directly connected to the social chaos caused by opium addiction and foreign interference. Led by a man who believed he was the brother of Jesus Christ, the rebellion devastated central China and killed an estimated 20 million people. The Qing government's response to these mounting crises was confused and ineffective. Traditional Chinese statecraft had no solutions for industrial age problems, and conservative officials who dominated the imperial bureaucracy resisted any reforms that might compromise Chinese values or traditions. They preferred to pretend that China's problems were temporary setbacks rather than fundamental challenges requiring fundamental changes. Some Chinese officials did recognize the need for modernization, but their reform efforts were consistently undermined by conservative opposition and foreign interference. The self-strengthening movement of the late 19th century attempted to modernize China's military and economy while preserving traditional political and social structures, but it achieved only limited success. Foreign powers were happy to sell China modern weapons and industrial equipment, but they opposed any reforms that might make China strong enough to challenge foreign privileges. The ultimate failure of Chinese modernization efforts was demonstrated in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895. Japan, which had successfully modernized its society and economy during the Meiji Restoration, decisively defeated China in a conflict that shocked the world. The student had surpassed the teacher, and China's defeat by its former vassal state was perhaps the most humiliating blow of all. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ended the Sino-Japanese War, completed China's transformation from regional hegemon to international victim. Taiwan was ceded to Japan. Korea became a Japanese sphere of influence, and China was required to pay yet another massive indemnity. More importantly, the treaty demonstrated that China was now fair game for any power with modern military capabilities. The scramble for concessions that followed the Sino-Japanese War saw European powers carving up China like a colonial territory. Germany seized Shandong province. Russia occupied Manchuria. Britain expanded its control over the Yangtze River Valley, and France established a sphere of influence in southern China. The Chinese government, bankrupt and militarily helpless, could do nothing but watch as foreign powers divided up their country. This was the nadir of Chinese civilization, a once proud empire reduced to a collection of foreign, controlled territories, its people addicted to foreign drugs, its government dependent on foreign loans, and its future seemingly controlled by foreign powers. The transformation had taken less than a century, but it was so complete that many observers wondered whether China would survive as an independent nation. The irony was that this collapse had been triggered not by military conquest or natural disaster, but by commerce, specifically by Britain's determination to find something that Chinese customers would buy. The British had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in creating Chinese demand for their products, but in the process, they had destroyed the very society they were trying to profit from. The opium trade continued to flourish even as Chinese society crumbled around it. British merchants, protected by their government's military power and legal privileges, expanded their operations throughout China. Indian opium was supplemented by production in Turkey and Persia, ensuring that supply would always meet demand. Chinese attempts to grow their own opium were encouraged by foreign merchants, who found domestic production easier to control than importation. By the end of the 19th century, opium had become completely integrated into Chinese economic life. Taxes on opium sales provided crucial revenue for both foreign, controlled ports and Chinese provincial governments. Opium dens were as common as tea houses in Chinese cities, and opium pipes were as familiar as chopsticks in Chinese homes. What had started as a foreign poison had become a domestic necessity. The social normalization of opium use was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire crisis. Generations of Chinese grew up in a society where drug addiction was common and accepted. Children saw their parents, teachers, and community leaders using opium, and naturally assumed it was normal adult behavior. The stigma that had initially attached to opium use gradually disappeared, replaced by resignation and despair. Literature from this period reflects the pervasive influence of opium on Chinese culture. Writers described opium dens as gathering places where scholars discussed poetry and philosophy, merchants planned business ventures, and officials conducted government affairs. The drug had become so embedded in elite Chinese culture that many users convinced themselves it enhanced rather than hindered their intellectual abilities. This cultural accommodation to opium addiction was facilitated by the drug's unique properties. Unlike alcohol, which produces obvious intoxication, opium allowed users to maintain a facade of normal functioning for years. Opium addicts could hold jobs, maintain relationships, and participate in social activities while secretly dependent on the drug. This made it easier for Chinese society to pretend that the addiction crisis wasn't as serious as it appeared. The medical consequences of widespread opium use were catastrophic but gradual. Unlike acute disasters such as earthquakes or plagues, opium addiction killed slowly and quietly. Users gradually wasted away over months or years, becoming less productive, less healthy, and less capable of contributing to their families and communities. The cumulative effect was a steady degradation of Chinese human capital that weakened the empire's ability to compete with modernizing Western powers. International observers were amazed and appalled by the extent of opium addiction in China. Foreign visitors described entire regions where productive agriculture had been replaced by opium cultivation, where public officials were openly addicted to drugs, and where normal social functioning had been disrupted by endemic addiction. China had become history's largest experiment in drug legalization, and the results were horrifying. Yet the British and other foreign powers continued to defend the opium trade on the grounds of free trade and individual choice. They argued that Chinese people had the right to purchase whatever products they wanted, and the attempts to restrict trade violated principles of economic freedom. This argument conveniently ignored the addictive nature of opium and the coercive circumstances under which the trade had been established. The hypocrisy of Western attitudes toward opium was breathtaking. While British merchants were promoting opium use in China, British society was becoming increasingly concerned about domestic drug addiction. The British government regulated opium sales within Britain, required prescriptions for medical use, and treated recreational drug use as a serious social problem. But these same concerns apparently didn't apply to Chinese customers. This double standard reflected deeper, racial and cultural prejudices that characterized Western attitudes toward China during this period. Many Westerners convinced themselves that Chinese people were naturally inclined toward vice and degradation, and that opium addiction was simply an expression of inherent Chinese weakness. This racist rationalization allowed Western powers to continue profiting from Chinese suffering while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. The Chinese government's response to the continuing opium crisis was hampered by its dependence on the very powers that were promoting drug addiction. Qing officials needed foreign loans to pay for government operations, foreign weapons to suppress rebellions, and foreign expertise to modernize their economy. This dependence made it impossible for China to take strong action against the opium trade without risking even more severe consequences. Some Chinese officials attempted to work within the system to reduce opium's impact on Chinese society. They promoted alternative crops to replace opium cultivation, established treatment programs for addicts, and tried to educate the public about the dangers of drug use. But these efforts were consistently undermined by the economic incentives that made opium profitable for everyone involved except the users themselves. The international nature of the opium trade also made Chinese countermeasures ineffective. Even if China could eliminate domestic opium production, foreign supplies would continue to flow through treaty ports controlled by Western powers. Even if China could reduce demand through education and treatment, new supplies of cheaper, more potent drugs would create new addicts. The Chinese were fighting a war against addiction with their hands tied behind their backs. As the 19th century drew to a close, it became clear that the opium crisis had fundamentally altered Chinese civilization. The confident, prosperous, and sophisticated society that had impressed 18th century European visitors had been replaced by a weak, divided, and demoralized nation struggling to maintain its independence. The transformation was so complete that many observers wondered whether the old China could ever be restored. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 represented a desperate attempt by ordinary Chinese to reclaim their country from foreign control. The Boxers, a secret society that combined martial arts training with spiritual practices, believed they could use magical powers to drive out foreign invaders and restore Chinese sovereignty. Their movement attracted millions of followers who were fed up with foreign exploitation, opium addiction, and the Qing government's inability to protect Chinese interests. The Boxers' anti-foreign rage was intimately connected to the opium crisis. Many of their supporters had seen their families destroyed by addiction, their communities impoverished by the silver drain, and their traditional way of life disrupted by foreign economic penetration. Opium dens, Christian churches, and foreign businesses became targets for Boxer violence because they represented the foreign influence that was tearing Chinese society apart. The rebellion's tragic climax demonstrated just how completely China had been transformed by decades of foreign interference. When Boxer forces besieged foreign legations in Beijing, an international army composed of troops from 8 different countries marched on the Chinese capital to rescue their citizens. The sight of foreign soldiers occupying the Forbidden City, the sacred heart of Chinese imperial power, symbolized the complete collapse of Chinese sovereignty. The Boxer Protocol that ended the rebellion imposed yet another crushing indemnity on China, 450 million silver taels, to be paid over 39 years with interest. This sum was larger than the Chinese government's entire annual revenue, ensuring that China would remain financially dependent on foreign powers well into the 20th century. The protocol also gave foreign powers the right to station troops in China permanently, supposedly to protect their citizens, but actually to ensure continued Chinese compliance with foreign demands. By 1901, the transformation of China was complete. The empire that had once been the world's largest and most sophisticated civilization was now effectively a colony of the Western powers. Chinese ports were controlled by foreign administrators. Chinese markets were flooded with foreign goods. Chinese finances were managed by foreign bankers. And Chinese territory was occupied by foreign armies. The Qing dynasty retained the formal trappings of power, but real control lay in foreign hands. The opium trade, meanwhile, had reached industrial proportions. An estimated 85,000 tons of opium were being consumed in China annually by the early 20th century, supporting an addiction rate that may have reached 25% of the adult male population in some regions. This represented the largest drug epidemic in human history, dwarfing modern addiction crises in both absolute numbers and social impact. The economic consequences of this massive drug consumption were staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that Chinese consumers were spending over 100 million silver dollars annually on opium by 1900, roughly equivalent to the entire imperial government's budget. This money, which should have been invested in productive economic activities, was instead flowing to foreign drug dealers, domestic opium farmers, creating a massive drag on Chinese economic development. The social costs were even more devastating. Entire generations of Chinese men grew up assuming that opium addiction was a normal part of adult life. Traditional Chinese family structures, which had been built around concepts of filial piety and mutual responsibility, crumbled as addiction turned parents into burdens and children into caretakers. The Confucian ideal of the scholar, gentleman, gave way to the reality of the scholar addict, too strung out to pass imperial examinations or serve effectively in government. Chinese intellectual life, which had flourished for centuries, was particularly hard hit by the opium epidemic. The imperial examination system, which had traditionally attracted China's brightest minds to government service, became increasingly irrelevant as real power shifted to foreign, controlled institutions. Many Chinese scholars turned to opium as an escape from the humiliation of seeing their country dominated by people they had traditionally considered barbarians. The military consequences of widespread opium addiction were equally severe. Chinese armies, already outgunned by foreign forces, were further weakened by having large numbers of addicted soldiers and officers. Military discipline, never strong in the late Qing period, virtually disappeared as commanders spent their time in opium dens rather than training their troops. When conflicts arose with foreign powers, Chinese resistance often collapsed not because of superior enemy firepower, but because Chinese forces were too drugged to fight effectively. The religious and cultural impact of the opium crisis was profound but subtle. Traditional Chinese beliefs about health, morality, and social responsibility were gradually eroded by the widespread acceptance of drug use. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all contained strong prohibitions against activities that harmed the body or disrupted social harmony. But these teachings were increasingly ignored as opium use became normalized. Christian missionaries, ironically, found their work both helped and hindered by the opium crisis. On one hand, the obvious social problems caused by drug addiction gave missionaries powerful examples of the need for moral reform and spiritual salvation. Many Chinese turned to Christianity as an alternative to the traditional beliefs that seemed powerless against the opium epidemic. On the other hand, the fact that Christian countries were the primary promoters of the opium trade created obvious contradictions that Chinese critics were quick to point out. How could foreigners claim to bring moral enlightenment while simultaneously poisoning Chinese society with addictive drugs? This hypocrisy undermined missionary work and contributed to the anti-foreign sentiment that would plague China for generations. The environmental consequences of opium cultivation added another dimension to China's crisis. As demand for the drug grew, Chinese farmers increasingly abandoned food crops in favor of opium poppies, which were more profitable but also more demanding of soil nutrients. Regions that had once been known for rice, wheat, or tea production became centers of opium cultivation, disrupting traditional agricultural patterns and contributing to periodic famines. The shift from food to drug production had serious implications for China's ability to feed its massive population. While opium farmers made short-term profits from their crops, the long-term consequences included soil depletion, reduced food security, and increased dependence on foreign grain imports. China was literally trading its agricultural foundation for a crop that weakened rather than strengthened its society. Water resources were also affected by opium cultivation and processing. The drug required significant amounts of water for both growing poppies and refining raw opium into smokable form. In regions where water was already scarce, opium production competed with drinking water and irrigation for food crops, creating additional social tensions and environmental problems. The cultural transformation of China during this period was perhaps most visible in its cities, where foreign influence was strongest and opium use most widespread. Traditional Chinese architecture gave way to European-style buildings, Chinese clothing was replaced by Western fashion, and Chinese social customs were modified to accommodate foreign preferences. Shanghai Canton and other treaty ports became hybrid cities that were neither fully Chinese nor fully Western, but something entirely new and strange. These cultural changes weren't just superficial adaptations to foreign presence. They reflected deeper shifts in Chinese identity and values. The confidence and cultural pride that had characterized traditional Chinese civilization was being replaced by a sense of inferiority and self-doubt. Many Chinese began to question whether their traditional culture had any value in the modern world, or whether wholesale Westernization was necessary for national survival. The intellectual response to this cultural crisis was complex and contradictory. Some Chinese thinkers argued for complete rejection of Western influence and a return to traditional Chinese values, while others advocated total Westernization as the only path to national salvation. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, seeking ways to combine Chinese and Western elements into a new synthesis that would allow China to modernize without losing its cultural identity. The language changes during this period reflected the broader cultural transformation. Chinese vocabulary was flooded with new terms borrowed from Western languages or created to describe Western concepts. Words for modern technology, political systems, scientific ideas, and social practices entered Chinese through translation or transliteration, gradually altering the very structure of Chinese thought. Educational systems were also transformed by foreign influence and the need to address the opium crisis. Traditional Chinese education, which had focused on classical texts and moral cultivation, proved inadequate for dealing with modern problems like drug addiction, industrial technology, and international relations. New schools were established to teach Western subjects, but they struggled to integrate traditional Chinese values with modern knowledge. The role of women in Chinese society was particularly affected by the opium epidemic. Traditional Chinese culture had already restricted women's social participation, but opium addiction made these restrictions even more limiting. Women whose husbands or fathers were addicted often found themselves responsible for supporting entire families while dealing with the shame and social stigma associated with addiction. Some women turned to opium use themselves as an escape from impossible situations, but female addiction carried even greater social penalties than male addiction. Addicted women were often abandoned by their families, forced into prostitution, or simply left to die in poverty and disgrace. The opium crisis thus had a disproportionate impact on Chinese women, who suffered both from their own potential addiction and from the consequences of male family members' drug use. Children growing up during the height of the opium epidemic experienced a childhood unlike any in previous Chinese history. Many saw their parents, relatives, and community leaders regularly using drugs, and naturally assumed this was normal adult behavior. Child labor became more common as families desperate for money to buy opium sent their children to work in factories or mines at increasingly young ages. Educational opportunities for children were severely limited by the opium crisis. Schools closed as teachers became addicted or communities could no longer afford to support them. Even when schools remained open, children often had difficulty learning because of disruption at home or their own exposure to drug use. An entire generation of Chinese children grew up with limited education and distorted ideas about normal adult behavior. The legal system was also corrupted by the opium epidemic. Traditional Chinese law had been based on moral principles and community standards, but these foundations eroded as drug use became widespread and socially accepted. Courts found it difficult to prosecute drug-related crimes when judges, lawyers, and witnesses were themselves users. The concept of justice became increasingly meaningless in a society where the law enforcers were often more corrupt than the criminals they were supposed to prosecute. Foreign legal systems imposed through the treaty ports created additional complications. Foreign residents in China were subject to their own country's laws rather than Chinese law, creating a dual legal system that undermined Chinese sovereignty and complicated efforts to address the opium problem. Chinese authorities couldn't prosecute foreign drug dealers, while foreign authorities generally had little interest in enforcing anti-drug laws that would harm their citizens' business interests. The medical consequences of widespread opium addiction were catastrophic but poorly understood at the time. Chinese traditional medicine had some experience with opium as a painkiller, but nothing in the Chinese medical tradition prepared doctors for the mass addiction epidemic they now faced. Western medicine, which might have offered better understanding of addiction's physiological effects, was largely unavailable to ordinary Chinese people. Public health systems, already primitive by modern standards, completely broke down under the pressure of the opium epidemic. Hospitals and clinics were overwhelmed by addicts suffering from overdoses, withdrawal symptoms, and the various diseases associated with chronic drug use. Medical resources that should have been devoted to treating cholera, smallpox, and other traditional health problems were instead consumed by addiction-related cases. The psychological impact of the opium epidemic on Chinese society was profound and long-lasting. The collective trauma of seeing their civilization collapse under foreign pressure while their people became addicted to foreign drugs created deep scars in the Chinese national psyche. Feelings of humiliation, anger, and helplessness became embedded in Chinese political culture and would influence Chinese attitudes toward foreign powers for generations to come. This psychological damage was compounded by the way Chinese leaders and intellectuals responded to the crisis. Rather than acknowledging the full extent of the disaster and taking decisive action to address it, many Chinese elites preferred to minimize the problem or blame it on external forces beyond their control. This denial and deflection prevented effective response to the crisis and allowed the problem to grow worse over time. The international community's response to China's opium epidemic was largely indifferent or actively hostile. While individual foreigners expressed sympathy for Chinese suffering, the governments and business interests that profited from the drug trade were determined to maintain their advantages. International law at the time strongly favored free trade principles over public health concerns, making it difficult for China to seek international support for anti-drug efforts. The few international efforts to address the opium problem were undermined by the economic interests involved and the racial prejudices of the era. Western powers were willing to discuss regulation of the opium trade, but only in ways that preserved their commercial advantages and legal privileges. Chinese requests for genuine international cooperation in fighting drug addiction were generally ignored or rejected. As the 20th century began, China faced a choice between national extinction and revolutionary transformation. The traditional imperial system, weakened by foreign pressure and internal decay, was clearly incapable of addressing the multiple crises facing Chinese society. The opium epidemic had become so integrated into Chinese economic and social life that eliminating it would require fundamental changes in everything from agricultural policy to international relations. The first attempts at systematic reform came during the final years of the Qing dynasty, as desperate officials recognized that dramatic changes were necessary for national survival. The new policies, launched after the Boxer Rebellion, included efforts to modernize education, military organization, and government administration, as well as ambitious programs to reduce opium production and addiction. These late Qing reforms achieved some success in reducing the scale of the opium problem, but they came too late to save the dynasty or restore Chinese confidence in traditional institutions. The reforms also created new problems by disrupting traditional social relationships and creating expectations for change that the imperial government couldn't fulfill. Revolutionary movements began to organize around the idea that only complete political transformation could solve China's multiple crises. The 1911 revolution that ended the Qing dynasty was directly connected to the social chaos and national humiliation caused by the opium epidemic. Revolutionary leaders like Sun Yat-sen explicitly linked their political goals to the need to eliminate drug addiction and restore Chinese sovereignty. The new Republic of China made anti-opium campaigns a central part of its nationalist program, though it would take decades to achieve significant results. The fall of the Qing dynasty marked the end of traditional Chinese civilization as it had existed for over 2 millennia. The emperor, who had once been considered the son of heaven, ruling by divine mandate over the world's most advanced civilization, was replaced by a series of weak republican governments that struggled to maintain basic social order. The transformation was so complete that China effectively ceased to exist as a unified nation for several decades. Warlordism. The fragmentation of China into competing military regions was both a cause and a consequence of the social breakdown initiated by the opium epidemic. Local military leaders who had originally been appointed to suppress bandits or collect taxes became independent rulers as central authority collapsed. Many of these warlords financed their operations through opium cultivation and trafficking, perpetuating the drug problem that had contributed to political fragmentation in the first place. The period from 1911 to 1949, often called the Warlord Era, saw China divided among dozens of competing military leaders, each controlling a few provinces and fighting constantly with their neighbors. This fragmentation made it impossible to implement coherent anti-drug policies or address any of the other problems that had accumulated during the imperial decline. Opium production and addiction actually increased during this period as competing warlords used drug revenues to finance their armies. Foreign powers, meanwhile, continued to profit from Chinese weakness and division. The treaty port system remained in place. Foreign businesses maintained their privileged positions, and international drug trafficking continued with minimal interference. The Chinese people's century-long nightmare of foreign domination and domestic addiction seemed likely to continue indefinitely. It would take another generation of revolutionary struggle, a devastating world war, and the complete destruction of traditional Chinese social structures before China could finally begin to address the opium problem that had destroyed its greatest empire. The Chinese Communist Party, which came to power in 1949, made the elimination of drug addiction one of its top priorities, using methods that were often brutal but ultimately effective. The successful Chinese campaign against opium addiction in the 1950s demonstrated that the problem could be solved, but but only through massive social mobilization and authoritarian control that would have been impossible under traditional imperial institutions. The cure was almost as traumatic as the disease, requiring the complete transformation of Chinese society and the elimination of many traditional freedoms and customs. Looking back on this history, it's clear that the opium epidemic did more than just create a drug problem in China. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of Chinese civilization and, by extension, world history. The confident, prosperous, and technologically advanced society that European visitors had encountered in the 18th century was replaced by a weak, divided, and impoverished nation that would spend the next century struggling to regain its independence and self-respect. The British, meanwhile, used the profits from the opium trade to finance their own industrial revolution and global expansion. The silver that flowed from Chinese drug addicts helped build British railways, factories, and military forces that would dominate the world for the next century. In a very real sense, Chinese suffering funded British prosperity, and the legacy of this relationship would poison Anglo-Chinese relations for generations. The opium crisis also demonstrated the destructive potential of unregulated international trade when combined with addictive products and imperial power. The British arguments about free trade and individual choice, which sounded reasonable in abstract economic theory, proved inadequate when applied to a product that created its own demand and destroyed its users' ability to make rational choices. The Chinese discovered what many societies have learned since some products are too dangerous to be treated as ordinary commodities. Perhaps most tragically, the opium epidemic showed how quickly a great civilization could collapse when faced with challenges that its traditional institutions weren't equipped to handle. The Chinese Empire had survived invasions, rebellions, natural disasters, and political upheavals for over 2,000 years, but it couldn't survive the combination of foreign, military pressure and domestic drug addiction. The social fabric that had held Chinese civilization together proved surprisingly fragile when subjected to stresses it had never before encountered. The story of how opium destroyed China's greatest empire serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of even the most successful societies to new forms of social disruption. It demonstrates the importance of adapting traditional institutions to meet modern challenges, the dangers of isolationism in an interconnected world, and the terrible human costs that result when economic interests are allowed to override public health and human welfare. For China, the opium epidemic represented not just a national disaster, but a fundamental challenge to Chinese assumptions about their place in the world. The experience of foreign domination and domestic degradation would shape Chinese political culture for generations, contributing to both the revolutionary movements that eventually restored Chinese independence and the authoritarian methods that Chinese leaders have used to maintain social control ever since. The 100-year struggle to recover from the opium crisis would ultimately make China stronger and more unified than it had been under the traditional imperial system, but at enormous cost in human suffering and cultural destruction. The confident, sophisticated, and culturally rich society that had been destroyed by opium addiction was replaced by a more modern and powerful nation, but one that had lost much of its traditional wisdom and cultural depth. Today, as China has emerged as a major world power once again, the memory of the opium epidemic remains a powerful force in Chinese political culture. Chinese leaders regularly invoke the century of humiliation as a reminder of what can happen when China is weak and divided. And they use this historical experience to justify policies aimed at maintaining national unity and preventing foreign interference in Chinese affairs. The opium epidemic's legacy also influences contemporary Chinese attitudes toward drug policy, international trade, and foreign investment. Having experienced firsthand the destructive potential of foreign, introduced addictive substances, Chinese authorities maintain some of the world's strictest anti-drug laws and are deeply suspicious of foreign business practices that might harm Chinese social stability or national independence. In the end, the story of how opium destroyed China's greatest empire is really a story about the unintended consequences of globalization, the vulnerability of traditional societies to modern disruptions, and the terrible human costs that result when commercial interests are allowed to override moral considerations. It's a reminder that economic progress and technological advancement don't automatically lead to human happiness or social stability, and that some prices are too high to pay for any amount of profit or power. The opium poppy, that innocent, looking flower that started this entire catastrophe, continues to grow in fields around the world, still producing the raw material for drugs that destroy individuals and societies. The Chinese learned, at enormous cost, that some problems require more than traditional solutions, and that survival in the modern world sometimes demands the abandonment of ancient wisdom in favor of new approaches that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history is that no society, no matter how successful or sophisticated, is immune to new forms of social disruption. The Chinese Empire's confidence in its own superiority and its dismissal of foreign barbarians as unworthy of serious attention contributed to its vulnerability when those barbarians proved to have weapons and methods that traditional Chinese defenses couldn't handle. The opium crisis thus serves as both a specific historical tragedy and a general warning about the need for adaptability, humility, and constant vigilance in an ever-changing world. It reminds us that the greatest empires can fall not through military defeat or natural disaster, but through the gradual erosion of social cohesion and moral authority that makes effective governance impossible. The flower that destroyed an empire has left its mark on world history in ways that continue to influence international relations, domestic policies, and individual lives around the globe. The story of opium in China is ultimately a story about human nature, social vulnerability, and the eternal struggle between short-term profits and long-term human welfare, a struggle that continues in different forms to this day.